Digital resources have made learning Chinese considerably easier than it used to be. But another problem has appeared. How can we make sense of and navigate the vast number of resources and find what's best for us? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm talking with my good friend Julien about his research into digital resources for learning Chinese. Julien recently finished his PhD at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, with a thesis titled Chinese Language Learning in the 21st Century, Towards a Digital Ecosystem. This topic, of course, interests me greatly, and so I'm happy to have Julien with me here on the podcast. This episode was recorded at the beginning of the year and was meant to include video, but because of technical problems, we will have to do with audio only. This episode is also much longer than usual, so let's get into it. Hi Julien, how are you doing?
Hi Ulla, nice to be with you on the podcast. I am doing very well. I'm calling from Australia where it's the beginning of summer and 30 degrees or something like that.
Yeah, we just compared that before we started recording, but we have about a few degrees centigrade here and it's pretty dark, and Julien is in the middle of the summer, so it's quite a contrast there.
Yes.
So part of the reason why we're talking about this is because Julien just submitted his thesis in cultural studies, and he's focusing on online Chinese learning tools, which is of course relevant for all of us and quite interesting. But that's maybe something we can get into in a bit. And maybe just we can start by, you can introduce yourself and let people know who you are. I mean, how did you get here? Why did you write a thesis about this? Why are you learning Chinese and all those things?
Yeah, well, I think there's two elements to the story. Main element is I moved to Australia in 2008 because I fell in love with an Australian that I met through couch surfing. And so I'm a European, French, grew up in Strasbourg, moved to Australia, and then Asia hit me in the face. It's fascinating when you move to here from Europe, how strong the Asian presence is. And so I thought that if I want to do anything meaningful in Australia, I'm going to learn Chinese. So that's the kind of the immediate prompt. The prompt before, I grew up in Strasbourg. When I was a kid, I used to play outside the Council of Europe in a park. And I really grew up in that European dream where learning each other's languages and learning about each other's cultures would be a way that we could build, I don't know, a kind of harmonious, evolved world where of peace, etc., etc. And so I kind of bought into that dream and got involved in it and became a language nerd, learned European language after European language, and was living this beautiful cosmopolitan life in Paris, and thought that I was, in contact with the rest of the world. And then when I discovered in Australia, when Asia hit me in the face, I realized that there was this entire part of the world that I knew nothing about. And so I just learned Chinese because I was embarrassed by my own ignorance, but also out of the excitement of discovering this new part of the world. So that's kind of that's how I got to learn Chinese. And then the PhD followed after that. Yeah,
okay. And I mean, we got to know each other many years ago when I think it was through Polo project, which is kind of well, maybe you can introduce it yourself. You know more about it than I do.
Yeah. So that was the first initiative after learning Chinese. At the time, so in 2011, I started this organization called Polo Project that was looking at using new digital technology to bring the thoughts of Chinese intellectuals, thinkers, cultural analysts to Western readers through collaborative translation. It was essentially a digital magazine. We're aggregating texts from around the Chinese blogosphere and inviting people from around the world to translate them into English, both so that the texts could be accessible, but also using translation as a way to practice language learning. And then that platform kind of evolved in different ways. But through that, I got in contact with a whole range of people who were also using technology to do things to help people learn Chinese at the time, including you. But yeah, a bunch of others, Skritter guys, and etc. etc. So I guess like both of us were part of that. I don't know if you have this sense of that moment in the early 2010s when it seemed that the internet offered the prospect of a kind of peer economy, collaborative creation of value online, and this kind of utopian world where we were going to create all these wonderful resources using the magic of the internet, and it would be this world of abundance and joy and friendship and connection around the world.
Yeah, it certainly sounds
yeah.
utopian, but yeah, I know what you mean, and I kind of agree with you that maybe people tended to have an overly optimistic view on how much digital technology could help out and so on. And obviously, we shouldn't. I mean, you know all about this, and we'll talk about it in your thesis, of course, but digital tools have, of course, contributed a whole lot, I think. But maybe it could be that people were a little bit over enthusiastic. I wouldn't say over enthusiastic, maybe there are some things that are difficult to get around, where optimism and kind of just collaboration in these senses maybe isn't enough, is what I'm saying. And I think that was kind of interesting, because I think everybody knows that you can use translation into the target language as a kind of practice. That's fairly obvious, and that is what lots of people do. But traditionally, I mean, reading, if we go back in history in language teaching, and like why we did language learning and so on, well, one of the purposes was, of course, to be able to translate to your own language. And that is actually quite an interesting bit. And I think that's how we got connected in the first place, because you wrote a blog post way back in ancient history. I don't know exactly when it was. Maybe around then, 2012, maybe, something like that.
Mm. Yeah, it's when we were young and had hair.
Yes. So, yeah, I always had this, what I was going to say, forehead, you say in English. But anyway, you have always been a kind of person for me that has like all these initiatives and projects going in what looks to me as fairly disparate areas. Like you deal with these things, you have this translation project, and then you have all these other projects. Maybe you'll get into those later a bit too. But Marco Polo project is, I think, where we all started. And then we also, we worked on Hacking Chinese challenges, and we discussed like, how do we do this thing? And it's kind of an attempt to build a community around, getting things done with your learning and so on, and sharing your progress and all those things. And maybe that's interesting for you to hear that in the past few months, I think that the challenges have really taken off. We've had a lot more people participating. In the previous 3 challenges, we've all had more than 100 people signing up. And it's been pretty active and a lot more community feeling than ever before, I think. And I'm not sure exactly what it is. Maybe I have put in a little bit more effort. Other people have come in to, sponsor, and not just sponsor in a passive way, but also coming in to actually engage with people and participate themselves. Like Skritter did this, for example. So Jake who is CEO of Skritter. He was participating himself and interacting with people and actually engaging. And I think that helps quite a lot. And when you kind of sustain that for a bit, you can build a community, which is otherwise kind of hard, right? And the other thing we also did was Hacking Chinese resources, which you also helped me. We discussed like, how do we categorize learning resources and so on. And now I think that was in 2014 or 15. So now we're here 6 years later, and you have actually written a thesis about this, which is super exciting. Would you mind telling us about it? Like, why did you do this? What is the thesis about? What are you doing? What can we learn from it?
Of course. I'll do it in stations and pause, because I could just now go into 5 hours of discourse. But so the thesis is essentially looking at this emerging landscape of tools, apps, videos, resources, that have emerged in the last, say, 20 years that propose to help people learn Chinese. And it's at a very high level, it's looking at mapping that landscape. So it's just asking, how can we make sense of that chaos? Because it's very chaotic. There's a range of stuff from, random Chinese dude sends videos on YouTube, to Chinese pod, to Hacking Chinese teaches you how to learn Chinese, to Skritter app, to Duolingo Chinese. So how can we make sense of this chaos so that we can use it better, so that we can improve what is already there, and so that we can coordinate, both as learners and as teachers, we can coordinate the way that we use those tools that exist to learn better. And as designers, we can improve what is already there or create the things that are missing, so we create a better ecosystem. That's really what the research is about. And the driver it was actually emotional. It's what I was talking to you about earlier. It's this sense of frustration and disappointment, quite frankly, that, I was working on Marco Polo project, other people were working on building things online, and there was this sense that we could create something that would be a coordinated set of tools available either for free or for quite cheap around the world that would work together and offer a good quality integrated curriculum for Chinese language learning. And that didn't quite emerge. It seemed that there were good things that happened. There's Pleco, that's great. There's Skritter, that's great. There's Hacking Chinese, that's great. There's Chairman's Bao. There's a lot of things that are good, but that really high quality integrated ecosystem that, would sustain the people who built it, etc., that was not present. And I was frustrated, and I just wanted to understand what is it that has been created and what has stood in the way of us creating this thing. So that was the driver for the thesis, I guess.
So I think that's something that I have, of course, everybody who has discussed or thought about this at all, or even just learners, it's very hard to know what's out there, and it's very hard to find anything. And like you said, it's not integrated at all. Like you can go online and you search for one tool that I want a tool that helps me check stroke order. Okay, great, I found that. And now I want something that helps me with listening. Okay, I found something. But then after a while you run into problems. But like you learn words here, but they don't plug into this app over here. And I also want grammar, but then I need to use, then this app doesn't have traditional characters that I want. And then I'm using this app over here, but I have my textbook, it's a big jigsaw puzzle essentially. And if you don't really know what you're doing, it's kind of hard to fit everything together to kind of form a personal curriculum, which is maybe what you were after. Is not maybe a personalized as such, but still something that people could make use of without being resource gurus and knowing about every single resource out there, because then it's kind of too late, right? It's too late for us to use the resources to learn Chinese anew because we've done it already. But yeah, so that's a challenge for sure. And just mapping this, even for someone who spends a lot of time thinking about these resources, sounds like a difficult task. Like, how do you start? How do you start something like that? It must be, there are so many different factors and so many different kinds of tools. So how do you do that?
So in terms of the process, I just looked at a large number of tools, particularly using the Hacking Chinese resources as a basis, but also just Googling and looking at the Google Store and the App Store. And then I identified recurring forms, etc. But eventually I kind of boiled it down to a quadrant with two main axes. So the first is asking, is the tool something that is highly interactive? Meaning at any moment in time, are you prompted to do stuff or not? So to give an example, you use the Duolingo Chinese app, you're constantly, putting in stuff. You read Hacking Chinese, it's not interactive. You read a blog post. Then the other dimension is the level of autonomy that you have. So is the tool one that guides you clearly in a process, step by step? So you go to, again, Duolingo Chinese, and it's very guided. It tells you what to do, or Skritter does. Or you go to a series of lessons, and lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3 on videos. Or you have a high level of autonomy, meaning are you in front of an open environment where you kind of constantly choose your own adventure? And you look at something, for instance, like the Chairman's Bao, you have a whole range of texts, and sure, they're classified by levels, but you just pick whichever one takes your fancy. And so using those two criteria, you have 4 types of tools. It's low interaction, low autonomy. It's scripted lessons. They can be podcasts or they can be videos. Then low interaction and high autonomy. You've got, I call them scaffolded content. So it's kind of native content with a bit of aids, so it can be subtitles or all sorts of things. Then you've got high interactivity, low autonomy. I call them drills and games. So you've got both everything to do with flashcards, Skritter and the rest, and those kind of learning games, Duolingo, Hello Chinese, etc. And then high interactivity, high autonomy. You've got engagement platforms, so things like Langate for collective editing, or things like italki, where you interact with a tutor. And what's important here to think about is that like none is better than the other. Each of them are useful at different moments in time and for different types of learners, but they're of different types. And then within each category, we can subdivide further, but that kind of high level distinction between four main types of tools, I think is one way to think about that chaos in a way that helps start to organize what's out there.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So essentially, if I were to summarize what you said, so you've created a kind of a map, as it were, of what resources are available, and you have like, it's a two-dimensional space. So we can see how much autonomy we have. That was the second category you have. And we can have those that are where you can do whatever you want, and those that are scripted. And then we have interaction or interactive versus non-interactive, which would be how much you're required to kind of do yourself, or how much input you give, I guess. And then you can then plot anything theoretically then within this kind of two-dimensional space here and say that, okay, this is highly autonomous and it's also highly interactive. So then it ends up being in this corner over here and so on. So one question is, when you draw maps, it's always the question, map versus territory, right? So there must have been lots of cases where, I mean, I understand that when you look at not all the data, but you looked at a fairly large number of tools, right? And you categorized them and you worked with them, and you arrived at this way of mapping them. But surely there must have been some weird cases or something that didn't really fit or felt a bit awkward or something. Can you remember any such cases that kind of were tricky to categorize?
So there's one thing, I'll first, I don't know if I'm going to evade your question or not, but what often did happen is that like what I would call a brand comprises of different tools. So typically you look at a thing like FluentU. So it's videos, they have scripted lessons and they have this autonomous engagement platform. It's a series of videos, they're kind of classified by levels. And that's clearly in that kind of bottom right, high autonomy, low interactivity. But then they also have a flashcard app that is embedded, that works together. And so you look at FluentU, well, it's the video plus the app, plus the flashcard, I mean. But clearly it's two tools brought together. Same as Pleco, it's got the dictionary and then it's got the flashcard. So very often there was the question of, okay, which one is the main one there? So kind of the labeling might have been an issue, but other than that, I haven't actually had a lot of difficulties classifying things. And I've kind of aggregated tools in 35 categories. What I might say though is there were some tools that were, I'd almost say, of a different nature and more fundamental. So there's a whole range of tools that actually now are almost equivalent to the operating system. And what I mean by that, there's a whole range of things that just convert your opinion to the characters, etc., or allow you to create a revision sheet where you have the tones marked up, or that allow you to, I don't know, extract all of the characters in a text that you don't know, ta-di-ta-di-ta-da. And those are really foundational and are kind of almost in a category of their own. And they're somewhat indistinguishable or completely continuous with just the pinyin input functionality on your iPhone.
Maybe more like tools that are, the infrastructure of learning and teaching Chinese, like things that enable you to do certain things that are not in themselves an innovative way of learning, or not actually a learning at all. It's just a way of conveniently doing something that you need to do. So yeah, I can see that those could be kind of a separate from from the others. They are not essentially aimed at teaching people for something really. Like if you have something that say, adds, I don't know, tone marks above characters, that app itself is not meant to teach you anything. Of course, they hope that you will learn something by using it, because you will then read text that has these tone marks added, of course. But it's not the app itself that does that. That's something you do outside of that, or maybe even you print it, or you do it with your something. So it's kind of different. Yeah, I can see that. So what I was thinking was that when I asked the question about things that were hard to map, I was actually thinking about many tools that do more than one thing, right? And this is actually kind of I wouldn't say pet peeve maybe, but it's something I feel is, I don't know, it's problematic, and it's kind of difficult to talk about, because it's so many things at once, I guess. But I feel that it would be good for learners to have an integrated system for learning, like a curriculum almost, where you have the tools figured out, you know how to do that, you know, if you got your listening, you get it from here, and if you want to get your videos, you get them from here, and then for character reviewing, you use this, and so on. Now, we know that there is no system that kind of does all of this very well. There is no such system, and I doubt there will be such a system anytime soon. Now, there are lots of apps that kind of try to do this, or at least they, on the surface, say that they're doing this. But the end result is sometimes what I feel is a kind of negative form of ecosystem, like a shut ecosystem that you say, hey, if you want to learn characters, you need to use this tool. And if you don't use this tool to learn characters, you're out of luck. It's not easy to integrate with other tools, for example. And then there are other tools that are the complete opposite. They do one thing and one thing only, and they strive to do that one single thing really well. And they don't care about the rest. And if you only use such tools, you can kind of build your own curriculum, provided that you know about the tools, you know how to combine them, and you also know, why do I need these tools? And that's typically not something that beginners know. Like, yeah, if you've learned many languages before, you probably know what kinds of things you need, but you still wouldn't know about which resources are available. But it seems to me that there's this kind of, not a clash, I wouldn't say, it's just different ways of looking at the problem. And it seems to me that the ecosystem approach only works if it's good. Like, if you get all the way. If you get like 60% of the way, it seems to me, at least me personally, when I use and learn languages, I don't want something that purports to go 100% of the way and then actually does 60%, but makes it really hard for me to make up for those missing 40%. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. Or I think I do. One thing that I noted, which is interesting, somewhat sad, somewhat problematic, is you could actually dispense with learning tools altogether if you were a highly motivated trained linguist. And then what you would do is use Google Translate and online dictionaries and your pre-existing knowledge of how to learn a language, and then join Chinese social media and go to Chinese websites and learn through that. And it's not impossible. It's just not something that, and your average beginner could do. What tools help you do is do that better. But then what would be ideal, what would be wonderful, is if we could have optimized tools that do one thing very well and work very well together. So integrate this, plugins to move the words around, et cetera, and some sort of guidance on how to use them well. So imagine, a very good set of podcasts that are graded, particularly for beginners. Grading is great. So kind of the less autonomous thing tends to be better for beginners, and then the more autonomous tends to be better once you go after more autonomous. And then, these great podcasts are paired with, let's plug in Skritter as arguably the best character learning app out there, and the Pleco dictionary. And then they work together, and then you graduate, and then you go on to really good curated content, say the Chairman's Bow, which is really good for like intermediate, engaging, modeled, etc. And then that's still paired with Skritter, so you keep learning characters, and you've got some sort of, system that tells you this is what we recommend that you do, and these are the best tools in each category. And that does not exist. I mean, the best that exists is your website that kind of guides people there, and some sort of digital tissue of motivated people that seem to guide each other towards each other's tools, and informal agreements. But it's not as if it's a clear curriculum or very clear guidance for a learner. It's made by well-intentioned people.
Yes, and in my case, it's only the main drawback is, of course, that I can say that if you have this problem with reading, do these things, or if you want to learn this, do that. But I still only say do that. I don't have like a solution where you can just go and do it. You still have to go to that separate service. You have to maybe buy a subscription, and then you have to deal, and then you still have a mountain of different things to integrate on your own, which is not very easy. So I thought about this. I thought about this many times actually, and especially for graded content. So I mean, like you mentioned with the podcasts. So in theory, it ought to be possible to do something like that, where you kind of collect all the, say, podcasts or all the graded readers, and you come up with one way of assessing or like grading the content, and then you kind of make a golden path from knowing this much to knowing like 1,000 characters or something. Now, what I think is the problem is that all the pieces are there, I think. 20 years ago, I shouldn't say 20, I didn't learn Chinese 20 years ago. I started learning, 13 years ago now. Back then, there weren't that many graded readers, right? There weren't that many podcasts, and there simply wasn't enough content around. But nowadays, there's quite a lot of content, actually. And I'm talking about graded content here, both in spoken form, but mainly in written form, right? So it ought to be possible to make this kind of guided approach thing. But for me, I think the problem that stands out is not really pedagogical as such. You could do it. I could write a proposal that kind of said how to do this, and maybe you ask a few people who know more about certain areas, and you could do this. But the problem with doing it is that, practically speaking, it's so hard to do, because you need to cooperate with 15 different companies. And some of these companies might change very fast. They might not be there 2 years from now. And then they change their subscription model, and suddenly it's difficult to coordinate these things. And that's why I don't do it. So I have Hacking Chinese resources, which by now has almost 500 resources listed. But then again, the whole idea here is, the premise or the assumption is that the resources, they are there. They're out there somewhere. It's just that they are very hard to find, and you don't know which they are, or if you have a certain problem, maybe you can't find a specific resource. And sometimes you don't even know that you're supposed to search for it, because you don't know that there is such a resource. Like you don't even know that the category exists, right? One thing I've realized is, of course, that the more such a catalog grows, because right now, Hacking Chinese Resources is essentially just a catalog, right? It's tagged and everything, so you can see, okay, I want beginner, I want listening, and I want like a collection of lots of stuff, not just advice about it. And then you can kind of see, okay, I tag this, and I get 43 resources. Okay, nice, I can check them out. But what happens when we have 1,000 resources? It's curated in a sense, but it's still too hard to navigate for people. People don't want to have 1,000 resources and try to find the best for them. That's still a monumental task. Like, how are they supposed to do that without knowing in advance what they need, right? It's hard to provide this navigation, the help to navigate all these resources.
Well, you were talking about subscription. One thing that I'm surprised at is that we are not more outraged by the lack of collaboration, and particularly the lack of institutional collaboration. Like, we find it perfectly okay that a whole range of countries heavily subsidize university programs and teachers in universities to create programs that are just for their local students, that are often behind it's not even a paywall, it's kind of the university learning management system. And they do the whole thing instead of saying, hey, Melbourne University, do the world's best, series of podcasts for early listeners. And hey, Uppsala University, what about you create the world's best series of videos for people who know between 1,000 and 2,000 characters? And hey, University of Paris, you do the world's best thing for tone learning. And it wouldn't be that difficult. It's public money that then leads to creating very good resources. And if we were able to collaborate at that level, we could have a limited number of resources that would be extremely good, made by experts, that could be globally circulated. And that's not happening because of simply a failure of governance, of organizing the way that we create educational resources on a global level as a public good. And I'm actually surprised that we're not outraged by it.
So and talking of waste, because this is a problem I kind of thought a lot about when I studied the master's program in Taiwan. I had started hacking Chinese back then. I started in 2012. I mean, I spent a fair amount of time learning Chinese. I knew most of the well-known resources, and I had a good grasp of, in general, what was around back then. And when you talk to people then in the academic world, the Chinese-speaking academic world, it seems like there are two different worlds, essentially. You have these tools developed usually by learners. So Skritter is an example, obviously not created by a university, but rather created by people who thought learning Chinese was interesting and this seemed like a problem worth solving, right? The character bit, I mean. And that's true for almost all of the main resources being used. Like Pleco is not created by a Chinese university, right? And that's almost the case throughout. There are very few of these big resources that are created by institutions. But that's kind of a bias a little bit because we tend to find these because that's what we're looking for, right? And then suddenly you stumble upon like a site. I found this, I don't even remember what it's called now. It's called something like 1,000 words of Chinese or something like that. And it's like a website created by, I don't remember who did it, but it's still around, and it's an old Flash site. So maybe it will die now when Flash goes out of service. But anyway, it's like these. You have 100 lessons with video, audio, explanations, vocab and everything, up to like 1,000 characters, 100 lessons. And it's entirely free, available online. And no one has heard of it. I haven't like studied this and analyzed it and seen if it's like pedagogically very good, but it looks at least as good as random textbook. And it's free. It has all this extra stuff and you can just use it, but no one knows about it. And I'm not bringing up this particular example because I think that's more important in general. I just think that there are hundreds, if not thousands of sites or services that have been built by probably like a time-limited grant or something. They get like 3 years of funding to do this. And then when the time is up, nothing happens, it dies, nobody cares, no one really spreads the word, and it just goes out of. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why we don't see this. I think maybe I'm not an expert in how university funding works across the world, but it seems to me that it's often time limited and it's dealt with in batches of 3-4 years maybe, and then the money runs out and no one does anything and it just dies. Whereas these private or privately developed things, they tend to go on as long as they're successful a little bit. Like if they work and people use them, well, they are still around usually. Is that something you saw in your thesis research too? I mean, this divide between things created by and for learners versus things created by, well, institutions for learners.
There's a number of things there. So yes, definitely there seems to be a trend where some of the tools, the apps that I see circulating among at least Western learners of Chinese, I use Western kind of loosely, but many of them have been created by people who were learners themselves. And then there is this whole world of what has been created in universities, possibly in China or in Taiwan, and that exists in some sort of parallel universe. So that definitely seems to be the case. So one profile that's interesting, it's almost as the kind of the startup story where you have a learner who, for whatever reason, got some sort of grant to go to China. And so here you have somebody in their mid to late 20s hanging out in Taiwan or in Shanghai or in Beijing or wherever, and they've got a bit of money and they're learning Chinese and it's a problem for them. And they're also thinking, what's my career going to be? What am I going to do with my life? Why don't I just try to start something online to learn Chinese and let's see where it goes? And they're a combination of, grit and luck, essentially. Combined means that it goes somewhere or it doesn't, or then, people end up working for universities or in the tech industry or wherever. But there's this recurring story. Yeah, that's a very different story from that of a university that receives funding to create something. When it comes to the university funding, so there's the time limit, but what I saw as a bigger problem is actually the scope. So here's this little, it's anecdotal. It was for, I think, high school learning. The state of Victoria, where I live, what was that? It was around 2012, 2013, launched an online portal to learn Asian languages. And it was developed by some sort of outsourced to some IT company. whatever online education company cost maybe $1 million or more. And at the time, I was running Marco Polo project. So I was running a charity organization devoted to the learning of the Chinese language with a high strategic priority for the government. I had received government grants, etc. I was in programs, I was a respectable person. And I said, hey, could I have access to your platform because I'm interested? And they said, do you have a student or a teacher account? And I didn't at the time. And I was not able to access that platform. So this was probably an extreme case. But anything that is developed, or most of the things that are developed by universities or funded by education departments, are narrowly optimized for institutions instead of being global in scope. Now, where that becomes absurd is that creating, say, character learning app or a really good set of podcasts for beginners, whether you do it just for Victoria or for all of Australia or for any English speaker or for anyone around the world, apart from server size, it's the same price. But weirdly, we're unable to generate public goods that are natively global. And so therefore, all of the universities are repeating the same work that they're doing, or they don't even know because, and then teachers are busy because they need to do everything. Because the administrators say everything needs to be done in-house. And maybe, they talk to their colleagues and they access resources, like they're not idiots and they collaborate. As individuals, people collaborate because they like what they do. But the institutional structures are not optimized for collaboration.
Yeah, and they might not even allow it, like you said. It might be a rule that says that this thing was built with this grant, hence it can only be used by people here. Absolutely. In this category.
Yeah. And if you create something that is global in terms of, how your career is rewarded, maybe you'll get a pat on the back. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll get into trouble. But if you create something globally and you write some obscure paper in some obscure magazine about it, then your career will go up. So, people want to do the good thing and they also do what they're incentivized to do. And they're certainly not incentivized to create the world's best Chinese learning resources to be shared and integrated in an ecosystem globally. That's not what our system is geared towards. And that is outrageous.
Yeah, it would be nice if it could happen. So let's be a little bit practical here. And let's look at your thesis here and your research, from a few angles. I've pondered different ways of doing, enrolling in some PhD studies myself many times, and I've pondered many different questions and what I would be interested in researching and so on. And I'm a very practical person. I love theory in certain areas and so on. I'm a big, for example, phonetics nerd, which is sometimes not very practical, but very interesting. But I still want what I do to have an outcome at the end that is interesting. I know everybody thinks their own research is interesting. I don't mean to say that yours is not. What I'm saying here is, let's see if we can, extract some nuggets of wisdom from your research that can kind of help different kinds of people. So let's say you are a student. So you're learning Chinese, maybe not super advanced. You don't know all the resources. You're like maybe a beginner and you're looking for resources. This person wouldn't gain a lot from reading your thesis itself for Chinese learning, of course. But what would your research is there anything in there that could, in the long run, maybe lead to a better situation for this type of person?
Okay, what could they learn from the research? So one, they could absorb, embody the idea of my learning is going to be transmedia. So I'm going to be using a range of different resources and create my own adventure. So they'll be empowered to do that. Mm-hmm. And the framework I described before, and then kind of later in the research, the kind of more granular description of, I distinguished 35 types of resources, can help them create their own curriculum by saying, okay, combine this, and using this vocabulary. So the idea is, if this vocabulary becomes more common, then people are more able to say, okay, this tool is a type of X and is the good or a bad type of X, and I need a type of X to do Y.
Yeah, okay.
So that's what might help them.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's essentially giving them not just the words, but the words also kind of hide or map to like mental tools you can use to understand what you're doing, right? Like you said with the modeling a while back.
Exactly.
And I think maybe that's interesting because it then tells us that I know this is a problem often that people say, hey, I see this when I read reviews of apps sometimes, and it's like you give the app a 1 star, and then you say, hey, too few videos. And then the app is actually about, it's a dictionary or it's something else. And people have this like, okay, no, you didn't have enough grammar exercises, but this is a podcast. It was never meant to have grammar exercises. So people evaluate tools as if they were in the wrong category. You say, okay, this hammer is really bad. I tried screwing in this screw here like for an hour and it didn't work. Super bad hammer. And maybe that's something that can come out of this. Maybe if we, like you said, and this, talking about it with you here is one way of getting these words out there. And maybe we can look forward to some kind of guest article maybe at some point. But so that's one thing, like evaluating the tools for what they're, in the correct area or space, as it were.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's one benefit. And I think the same applies for teachers. So if you're teaching, whether you're teaching, like your profession is a teacher and you work in a school and university, or you're, say, tutoring people as an independent teacher, you can identify what types of tools exist and therefore guide your students so that for the same number of hours of contact, they progress faster because you give them the right tools and you help them learn on their own better. So I think that's something that can really be gained, which is the effectiveness of teachers in guiding their students. And here it's about identifying what types of tools exist and what you can use them for, but also having that kind of lucidity of what do I need to look out for in order to identify what makes a good tool or a bad tool, depending on the category that it's on.
So maybe, yes, so this is, like you said, it's essentially the same thing as for a student, but teachers do it for their students, and they can, of course, have a better knowledge about the tools available and also about the model you use to categorize them. So maybe we could, in theory, we discussed this actually further back before you actually got into actually writing the thesis and you did the research. We talked about doing like a pilot with Hacking Chinese resources, where we would maybe use this model that you have to categorize resources, not just for research purposes, but actually for visitors. Imagine that you could go to a resource, okay, so you click on Pleco, and then you get a little graph that says, autonomy, and it says like interactivity. And you can kind of see where it is, and you can see other things that are in this area. I don't know. Things like that could be possible. I don't look forward to, retagging 500 resources, but it's doable and it's possible, right? So things like this maybe could come out of something like this. So let's imagine I'm an app developer. I'm not, but I still work with, say, Skritter, for example, and I talk a lot with app developers. And it's funny that you mentioned that, someone learning Chinese and wanting to do something and contributing. I think I've received maybe a dozen questions from people who develop their own flashcard apps. Most of them are creating exact copies of, say, Anki with like a minor twist or something. Some of them are good. I'm not saying they're bad, but this thing that you mentioned is very common. It happens a lot, right? So if you are an app developer, maybe you are thinking, hey, I learned Chinese. I think I want to contribute. I have some ideas. I want to do stuff. Or maybe if you're a company and you're already doing this and you want to expand or contribute or do something better. So what should you do? How can your research help the developers create better tools?
So I think that it can allow them to do one of two things. Either they kind of identify that an existing app or tool could be improved for what it intends to be. Say, I've got an idea to do a better flashcard app. Let's identify the next best one, maybe Skritter, and then write to the Skritter guys, hey, do you want to work with me on improving what you're doing, rather than creating something else that has the same functionality. So it's this kind of collaborative model, in the same way that, instead of creating your own magazine, you work with one that exists. That would be one approach. The other is because I'm trying to, I think I've given at least a high level map of what's out there. If you have an idea that is genuinely original of something that does not yet exist and that fits in with the rest, then you can create that and look at how will what I develop be useful for a learner as part of their learning journey. Like where does it fit? And then you liaise with your complementers. So I don't know, because I don't have an idea right now, something that doesn't quite exist to come up with, but you come up with that, and then you see that, you know, it interacts well with podcasts. And then you reach out to whatever are your favorite podcasts, and then you say, hey, I'm thinking of creating this thing. It would work well with what you do. Could we work together? Would you like to advertise it, share it with your learners, da-da-da-da? And you reach out to Hacking Chinese to have a post saying, hey, I'm doing this thing, and it doesn't exist yet. It would work well. So yeah, so it's identifying, am I creating something that's really new and then I should do it? Or am I just looking to upgrade what's there? In which case, maybe I should collaborate with what's already being done.
So essentially more collaboration, or at least consider collaboration with before reinventing the wheel the 50th time, unless you really have a genuinely good new thing that isn't there at all or something.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, I mean, what I was describing was if you actually want to generate value for everyone. Because if what you're looking for, which is what a number of people want, is to, you know, push yourself forward, then, you know, go ahead and put videos on YouTube. And if you're cute or funny or quirky, maybe they will be picked up, and then that will be good for you. But that's not creating a lot of value for the ecosystem.
Julien, I'm not sure we are either quirky or cute, though. So I think this will probably not take the world by storm. But hopefully some people will find it interesting. So we've talked about your research a little bit. We talked about some of the other things we've done together and so on. But I was thinking, are there any other things related to these, or maybe something completely different you think we ought to talk about or you want to bring up?
Let me think. So there's one thing that I'm interested in, and that's related to this question of collaboration. So part of the reason why I was very interested in learning Chinese was through this, like this expansion of the European dream to the Asian world and the Chinese speaking world. And if we look at the evolution of geopolitics today, I'm not sure that that's the dominant trend. But my sense is that people who do speak Chinese and are learning Chinese have an important role to play in self-diplomacy, globally speaking, and maintaining conditions of fruitful dialogue between the Chinese-speaking world and the rest of the world. And that the work that we're doing in promoting language learning, there's a kind of neutrality and an importance of that work we're doing, not just to satisfy our capacity to communicate in Chinese, but as part of that broader diplomatic engagement and effort to understand China. And that there's something about the difficulty or the obstacles to collaborating effectively, to effective collaboration with Chinese generated tools, and more general efforts at collaboration between, say, the PRC and the rest of the world at the moment, that may have similar cultural roots in lack of cultural familiarity or divergent or different underlying models, and that we could contribute to improving that situation.
And you mean not just by helping people learn Chinese now, because that would help, but very indirectly and long term.
Indirectly, yeah. Well, helping people learn Chinese, because then you learn Chinese and then you read Chinese, and then you have, and then you begin to have a connection with China, which is more complex, more nuanced, and it's less like this, you know, scary, shapeless ghost, and something that's just as messy as the rest of the world, with a mixture of good and bad. And that's got a great tempering effect on your own emotions, and possibly so those of the people around you. So the work we're doing teaching Chinese is important for that, but also the work we're doing of kind of creating a global network of people engaged in teaching Chinese. So that kind of ongoing social networking work that we're doing, I think, is also important as, I don't know, let's not be shy of the word, as an act of peacemaking. And I think that we should rejoice in that and be happy that we're doing it.
I mean, it certainly lends more importance to what we're doing, apart from the kind of intellectual quest to teach something as well as possible, right? Which is also interesting, but it's nice to know that I mean, hopefully it has some positive effects beyond that. Speaking of that, beyond things, actually, I was going to ask you, like, what are you doing now? You've submitted your thesis, and I assume you will. You want to spread the word about your model and all that, and I'll help you as much as I can. But what other things are in store? What will Julien do in the coming years?
So there's a few things that are coming that are, it's indirect. It's not directly connected to learning Chinese. So there's work, I'm working with a friend on editing a book on governance in China. So that China work continues. I'm working on another book on governance models, and it's essentially around how do we organize collective action. So that aspect of the thesis, how do we collaborate better, is something that I'm very interested in. And then I've got let's call it a personal project, which is working title School of Decision Making. But it's around how can we train people in making better decisions? And that thing around choosing your own language learning methods, so that autonomy, that freedom that comes with the capacity to learn yourself, is one of the things that I'm building on to then go further and look at, okay, how can we expand that and actually create a methodology and a curriculum that possibly integrates elements of language learning, but to think more around how can we interact with people, listen better, and make better individual and collective decisions. Okay. So those are some of the directions that I'm taking.
And in case anybody wondered what I said when Julien was the kind of person who had lots of initiatives and projects going on, I think you have a very good example here. So last, before we round things off, if people want to know more about you or know more about all these interesting things that you're doing, how can they find out about you?
So Julien Lair, Leyre, Google me. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm at julienlair.com. That's my kind of professional website. I'm on julienlair.me, and that's where I publish reflections, blogs, etc. Or for the governance work that I do, it's under Future of Governance Agency, FOGA, thefoga.org. And you can find me in those various areas. But maybe Google me. I've got a rare name. I think I may be the only Julien Lair on the planet. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's the nice thing with having a unique name. I'm not sure if I'm the only one, but I'm the only one you can Google easily, at least with my name. And I think it's the same for you, right? So people don't risk finding other people. I guess that could be a curse theoretically, but so far it's pretty convenient. I will of course put links to your sites so people can find them. But in case people are listening, they know at least where to go. So a big thanks to Julien for this interview. I hope that you enjoyed our talk as much as I did. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.